The purpose of this video is to give you some background for our tissue lab. We generally run out of time in the semester for full-blown tissue lecture, but it is part of our requirement for transferability for Biology 102. So to fix that, we usually just cover tissues in lab. So I want to give you a little bit of notes and a little bit of background. As we go through this lecture video, you'll see that on some of the slides there's a text box that says background. You don't need to take notes on that. You might want to jot down just a few notes if they help with your understanding for what you need to know, but those items won't specifically be tested. However, please don't skip over those because they contain information that's going to be helpful for completing the lab. So just because I'm not testing on it doesn't mean it's not important. If I wasn't testing on it and it wasn't important, I wouldn't have it in the video. Especially when we get to plants, because plants are probably a little bit less familiar to you. There's a little bit more background information. And again, especially for plants, when we start looking at the microscope images and things like that, some of the cells are going to be a little bit harder to distinguish. So it'd be a good idea if you had general sense of what the structure of some of these plant tissues might look like. So we're going to go through the 4 different types of animal tissues and 2 different types of plant tissues. We're going to talk a little bit about organs and organ systems. Generally, we're not going to test on any of the organs in animals. We are going to test on a couple of organs in plants, mostly because they're relatively simple and they're obviously, just like in animals, directly related to the tissues, but they're a little bit less complex, and so we are going to kind of talk about the function of the organs and the tissues as opposed to just doing tissues in animals. So plant bodies and animal bodies are generally organized in a similar way. This organization is based on our levels of biological organization, where structures get successively more complex. So this is something called emergent properties that we saw in Biology 101, where you put together lower levels of organization and get new functions as you get more and more complex. So plants and animals all start out as a single cell, and then they go through multiple divisions to produce the multicellular organism. As they grow and develop, their cells go through differentiation, which is where certain cells become specialized. So this is very, very early on in embryonic development, whether that's plant or animal embryo. And very early on, these cells, all of the cells, sort of follow a path. So based on what genes are activated in those particular cells, they follow a path for development. And once they sort of get on that path, they are locked in and differentiate into specific cell types and then develop into tissues and organs. So we are mostly going to cover tissues, cells and tissues. We are going to talk about organs just a little tiny bit to give you context of where those tissues are. If you go into anatomy physiology series, or if you take botany, you'll learn a little bit more about the overall structure and function of the organism. But in Biology 101 and 102, we really just kind of stay at tissue level and lower. So here's an example of our organization. I'll let you look through this in a little bit more detail. It's also in your textbook if you would like to go through that. If we look at our muscle cell up on the top, our muscle cells are combined together with other similar cells into tissue. So tissues are essentially a group of cells that perform a similar function, have a similar structure. And then those tissues are organized into organs. So our example here is a urinary bladder. You'll see that once we get to our organ level, we have combinations of all of our different cell types. Now you can't see anything really except the muscle tissue on the outside of this bladder, but it is also composed of our 3 other types of tissues as well. And then that bladder is organized into a bladder system where it is connected to the other organs within the body of our organism. So tissues are a group of cells that all have a similar structure and function. So we saw a picture of muscle cells on the previous slide where you have all of those muscle cells sort of lying together, and then as a group they take on a very specific function. Tissues are always going to have specific functions because they have a specific cell type. So in biology, we often talk about the relationship between structure and function. And the unique structure of a particular cell or a particular organism leads to a particular function. So you could think about hummingbirds and their shoulders with the ability to hover and their long beaks with their ability to drink nectar from deep flowers. They have very specific structures that give very specific functions. For our tissues, these functions are all going to be related to transport, absorption, and detection of stimuli. Now, this is the same for both plants and animals. They have to transport fluid, they have to absorb nutrients, and they have to interact with their environment. And so all of our tissues are going to be related to that. And if you think about the tissues that we see in animals, you probably can recognize what all of these are doing. So we have 4 types of tissues in the animal body. You'll need to know all 4 types and what they do. And it would probably be a good idea to have an example of a couple of these that you're less familiar with. So for example, if you're not as familiar with epithelial tissue and connective tissue, you might want to jot down a couple of notes to help you sort of visualize what these tissues are. Our muscle tissues are made up of cells that are designed to shorten and contract. And when they shorten and contract, this generates force that is going to allow for the movement. We are not going to talk about the mechanics. That would be A&P1 at SWIC. If you are interested in learning about that, we are just going to focus on the types of muscles for now. There are 3 types. There's skeletal muscles that are attached to bone, or the exoskeleton for locomotion and control. So remember that in our invertebrates, many of them, like our arthropods, we have exoskeletons and they still have muscles. They just have muscles on the inside instead of muscles that surround the bone like in animals. Then we have smooth muscles. Smooth muscles are the muscles that surround our cavities. So think your esophagus, your intestines, your stomach, and how those muscles sort of contract and open up in and out, and their job is to push food through. We also have muscles that do this for our blood, for our lungs. And these are all involuntary control. So this happens whether you are thinking about it or not. This is why you don't have to think about digesting your breakfast. You don't have to think about breathing because the smooth muscle just acts. This is in contrast to the skeletal muscle that is all voluntary control. So even if you're not specifically thinking about the muscles that you're moving when you're walking, you have to make the choice to walk and to move forward. So that's where the difference comes in the control. And then we have cardiac muscle. This is muscle that's only found in the heart. And of course, this is involuntary control as well. Your heart just beats whether you are thinking about it or not. All living organisms interact with their environment. This is one of the characteristics that we sort of assign to living organisms. Animals and plants can interact with their environment in a more complex way than, say, a single-celled prokaryote or a single-celled eukaryote because of the tissues that they have in their bodies. Now, plants don't have nervous tissue, but they do have the ability to respond to their environment and interact. Animals can respond to their environment in a variety of different ways, and the nervous system and the muscle tissue are going to act in a way to help organisms sort of move through their environment and maybe get away from a predator or go towards a food source, something like that. Our nervous tissue is going to sense, I'm sorry, our nervous tissue is going to allow us to sense changes in the environment, stimuli in the environment, and then also make a response to it. To sense and respond to their environment, the nervous tissue generates electrical signals. So the nerve is stimulated. This is a way that we receive a signal. So if you touch something hot or touch something sharp, you have received a signal through sensing through your neurons. The neurons then generate an electrical signal that they pass from the stimuli all the way through your nervous system to the brain. And we're not going to talk about how this happens. Again, that's anatomy, physiology. But I just want you to be familiar with the fact that your neurons are spread all the way throughout your body, and that's why you sense stimuli from sort of any direction. And then, of course, we have different sense organs. We've got our eyes for vision, ears for sound, all of that. So any sort of sensory input is going to be conducted through electrical impulse through our nerve cells. So a single nerve cell is called a neuron, and we'll look at this in a little bit more detail in our lab. But in the center of the neuron, there is a nucleus, and then all of our cell structures. Coming out from that are structures called dendrites. So dendrites are the part of the nerve cell that's going to receive the stimuli. And then there is a long, almost like an arm that comes off of the main body of the nerve called an axon. And that axon is going to be what passes the signal from one nerve cell to another. So electrical signals in a nerve are used to stimulate other tissues. So a nerve can actually stimulate its own, or initiate its own signal. So for example, in your brain can initiate a signal without an external stimuli. Your nerves can also send electrical signals to stimulate your muscles to contract, and also to stimulate your glands to release chemicals. So really anything that needs to happen in your body is a result of your nervous system sending a signal and causing a change in one of your tissues. Our third type of tissue is epithelial tissue. So our epithelial tissue acts as basically covering and protection for our organs in our bodies, and they also act to line the walls of our body cavities. So in just a second, I'm going to show you an example of different types of epithelial tissue, and their general structure allows them to protect the structures that they enclose, and also to secrete ions and molecules, to transport ions and molecules, so meaning across a membrane, so through absorption. So for example, from your stomach, we've got lining of epithelial tissue, and that epithelial tissue allows you to bring in food molecules that you might have from your diet, or also to secrete ions and enzymes for digestion. Epithelial tissue is asymmetrical, meaning it is depending on its location. There are different types of tissues that make up any particular organ. One side of it is going to be connected to the extracellular matrix. So the extracellular matrix is basically a system of fibers that connects one cell to the other. So if you think about your stomach, you've got this inside that is the lining of the body cavity. That's not going to be connected to any other cells other than the ones next to it. But on the backside, on the sort of the inside layer of the lining of your stomach, that's going to be connected to other cells. And it is connected by that extracellular matrix. Compared to nervous tissue or muscle tissue, there are several different types of epithelial tissue. So there's essentially one type of neuron. There's just 3 types of muscle tissue, but there are several different types of epithelial tissue. So I would suggest that you just kind of look through this, pause the video, and just look at where these different tissues are in this mouse, to kind of get an idea of what their job is. So if you look at the lungs, what might the job of the epithelial tissue who's acting in protection and transport, what might that be? Just to kind of get an idea of what our epithelial tissue is doing. You can also see that there's a variety of different structures here. You do not have to identify the different structures of epithelial tissue, although in our lab you will look at a couple of different types of those tissues. Our last type of animal tissue is connective tissue. Connective tissue, just like it says, acts to connect our different tissues and organs. So for example, blood is a connective tissue that transports nutrients and oxygen in between our different tissues and organs. There are several different types of connective tissue, just like our epithelial tissue. There's a variety of different structures and functions here. On the next slide, I'll show you a figure that kind of relates all of these connective tissues and has a little blurb about what they are. I would suggest jotting down just a quick note of what each of these are, just so you can remember. So of course, blood is our connective tissue that transfers nutrients and oxygen. Blood itself, or the connective tissue blood, is made up of a relatively small number of cells. So we do have a lot of blood cells in the fluid that makes up our blood and our blood plasma, but surrounding that blood is a non-cellular matrix. In this case, it's essentially water and the water that and all of the nutrients that are contained within that water. Adipose tissue is a fat layer. Bone and cartilage, of course, are for structure and movement. And then loose and dense connective tissue have a variety of different functions. Again, on the next slide, I'm just going to pause there and let you jot some notes on what these are. You do not need to know crazy details, but you do have to have at least a general idea of what each of these types of connective tissue does. Kind of like the epithelial tissue, just kind of a broad understanding of what the function is. So finally, once we are ready to look at structures larger than our tissues, we are going to put multiple tissues together to produce our organs. So we've got our stomach here. This is a great example of the 4 different types of tissues that we see. So the outer layer and the inner layers are composed of our epithelial tissue. Remember, epithelial tissue is on the outside and acting as a protective layer, and then on the inside, usually acting as some sort of absorptive layer. So we've got our epithelial tissue. Then we've got our connective tissue that hold all of the different structures of the organs together. So if we look at this image here, we've got our connective tissue layer here. Remember that our connective tissue is going to connect our different tissues together, connect our different types of bodies, or different parts of our body. So in this case, this connective tissue is acting to hold together, for example, our epithelial tissue on the outside and our muscle layers, along with our nervous tissue, a layer away from the outside. Of course, we've got our smooth muscle that allows our stomach to expand and contract. This is going to aid in our digestion, but also movement of whatever it is through the body. So it's not just our stomachs, but anything that is doing any sort of movement. And then, of course, our nervous tissue helps to regulate that smooth muscle activity. So even though our smooth muscle is involuntary, we still have nerves that are firing, that are causing that movement and that contraction.